So I'm going to talk about the phenomenon of people learning their own constructed languages well enough to more or less fluently use them. I first got interested in this subject pretty soon after I got seriously interested in conlanging and linguistics in general. In 1996, I read an article on Rick Harrison's website by Javat Pierugia, the Australian poet and conlanger, about his constructed language Tanarei, or Tanarei is the English form of it. And more importantly, the use he put it to. He wrote his diary in Tanarei from 1968 to 1978 in his teens and early 20s, and then changed his name legally to a form derived from Tanarei. The Javat Pierugia is not his birth name. Then he abandoned the language for some years before resuming use of it and development of it in the late 80s. When I first read this article, it wasn't the structure of the language that fascinated me so much as the idea that someone could learn a language that no one else speaks well enough to use it as he'd done, to write your diary, to use it for private communication with yourself, for your thoughts, for your notes to yourself, for your recording of your experiences, of your mental life. But it was 2 years before I started developing a conlang that I could use for that purpose myself. The language I now call Yazumban. It had other names in the early stages. By 2002, I had developed it well enough and learned it well enough that I could start using it, not constantly, but intermittently for the purpose I designed it for, primarily writing a diary, which I had been keeping in English and then intermittently in Esperanto since 1988. Though I've learned it well enough to write pretty freely and reread what I've written, I hesitate to call myself fluent without qualification. When we use the word fluent, we usually mean someone is able to speak a language freely at conversational speed on a wide range of subjects. But there are various modes and degrees of fluency. We can talk about qualified fluency, talk about passive fluency, when someone is able to read a language pretty easily even if they can't speak it, or if they can understand it spoken even if they can't speak it or write it. There are various degrees of fluency. Should I stand further back? There are various degrees of fluency in terms of someone's error rate, how often they make various errors in pronunciation or in grammar or word choice. None of us are perfectly fluent, even in our native language. We occasionally make mistakes in pronunciation and grammar and word choice, even in our native language, and in languages we're less fluent in, we make those mistakes more often. There are various speeds we can use a language with. There are some languages I can use at conversational speed, English and Esperanto, and then French I can read it well enough the use of it is not painful and uncomfortable, but I can't understand it spoken at conversational speed, for instance. We could have different ranges of subjects that we're comfortable talking about or discussing in a language. Even a natively bilingual person, for instance, might be more comfortable talking about their professional life in one language and their personal life in another language, just because those are the contexts in which they routinely use those languages and have good vocabulary in. It seems that very few conlangers are thoroughly fluent in their conlang in all modes, able to use it freely in every form at conversational speed. But there are a fair number of others who are somewhat fluent in one mode or another. For instance, able to read and write the language at a useful normal speed, as I can use Yazumban and Javat Pierugia used Tanarei for his diary. But many conlangers have no intention of becoming fluent, and make no attempt to do so. We could possibly bring in here Ferdinand de Saussure's distinction between lang and parole. Lang being the structure of language, what we call the grammar or lexicon, whether that's as described on paper or in a web document or whatever, or as exists passively in the neural structures in our brain of a fluent user of the language. And parle being the actual use of the language, the set of all the things that people have said and written in the language. It seems to me that most conlangers are primarily interested in lang, and a minority are more interested in parle. Most conlangers being interested primarily in developing their language, in the process of inventing it, and a minority being more interested in what happens after you get it developed to a certain point when you can start using it to say original things in it. Or, as Sally discussed in what we were saying in our conlangs thread on the conlang mailing list a while ago, to find new ways to say old things. I did a survey last year, and the results are up here, which I'll get to in a few minutes after talking about some higher level issues. I devised questions trying to tease out these distinctions in fluency. Whether someone's fluent in this mode or that, to what degree they're fluent, and so forth. And posted to the Conlang mailing list, the Zelda bulletin board, the Live Journal Conlangs community, and a few other places. Then, after a while, I emailed the survey to specific people who I heard were fluent in their conlangs or were trying to become so. So there are obvious flaws in the sampling methodology. First of all, there's the self-selection bias. The survey is posted out there, and anybody who's interested enough to answer these however many questions, I haven't even counted accurately how many questions there are, but there's under 45 heads, there's over 70 questions. So the length of the survey is probably a deterrent to people who would only have casual interest in conlang fluency. Although I said in the introduction, I'd like to get some feedback from people who aren't interested in fluency or aren't yet fluent, so I can compare them with those who are fluent in demographic variables and in the typological variables about their conlang. And then there's the surveyor selection bias, where I specifically picked out specific people and said, please answer this survey. I know you're interested in this subject, so even though you're not reading these lists, you're not seeing the survey perhaps, can you please answer it? So given these flaws in the sampling methodology, I would not draw any strong conclusions about the demographics of conlangers in general, or about the proportion of conlangers in general who are either interested in becoming fluent or have succeeded in doing so. And I plan to do a follow-up survey later on after doing more analysis of the responses from the first phase, sending it possibly to everybody, but more likely just to those who answered yes to one or more of the fluency questions. Someone else, I've forgotten who at the moment, did a brief, simple poll on the Zelda bulletin board in March 2008. Can you speak your conlang? Given the simplicity of the poll, it's hard to compare directly the responses there to the responses on my survey. But just at a high level, by my count, there were 30 people replying to that thread saying no, and 13 who said yes or more or less qualified yes. Are there any questions at this point? Going back in conlanging history, there are only a few people before about the 1960s that I know to have been fluent in their conlangs or strongly suspect to have been so. There are two people Sally talks about in the historical chapter of her book that I think might have been fluent in their conlangs from what I've read about them, but I'm not at all sure. George Salmanazar, who had a hoax conlang pretending to be a native of Formosa, modern Taiwan, passed himself off as a man from Formosa and had a conlang which he passed off as the language of Formosa, and spoke this language and taught people something about it. It seems he might have had a certain amount of fluency in order to carry off this hoax successfully. Later this was early 18th century, I've forgotten the exact dates, don't have them here. Hélène Smith, a French medium, would, in a trance or reported trance, give psychic messages from the Martians, and in a Martian language, which seems to have been a relapse of French. And probably in order to speak those messages fluently in the trance, she must have been to some degree fluent in the language, or else had at some point rehearsed those messages until she could speak them freely without hesitation. Then Johann Martin Schleyer, the creator of Volapük, the first international auxiliary language to get a wide following, was not yet fluent in the language when Antoni Grabowski first visited him. I don't know the exact date of that visit, but I think it was fairly early after the publication of the language, which was in 1880. But it seems reasonably likely that Schleyer was fluent in the language, at least to some degree, by 1889, when the third Volapük conference was held, and its working language was Volapük. Zamenhof, on the other hand, the creator of Esperanto, we know also from Grabowski's evidence, was already fluent in the language pretty soon after the first Esperanto book was published, if not before. When Grabowski met Zamenhof for the first time, they were able to converse in the language pretty much right away. And some Esperanto historians have speculated that he had practiced the language with his wife before the publication of the book. But we don't know that for sure, at least I don't. I've been planning at some point to dig more into this history and pin down the date of Grabowski's visit to Schleyer, for instance, but I haven't yet got all the details here. Alexander Goethe, the primary creator of Interlingua, also seems to have been fluent in Interlingua to some extent. He wrote in a letter to William Old of 1963, "I do wish to report that it has happened that in an attempt to cope verbally with an experience, I failed in my native German, failed also in my acquired English, and came closest to succeeding in Interlingua." Are there any questions at this point? Yes?
This is going back a little bit, but since many people, they're the only person who know their conlang, do you have any standard for fluency?
We'll get to that when we look at the survey response.
Okay.
Each of the response tables is going to have a quote of the exact question on the survey, and you can judge from that how well you think I discriminated in figuring out what people's actual fluency is based on what they would say in response to that kind of question. I freely admit that, in retrospect, some of the questions were too ambiguous or too open-ended and should have been phrased differently. But for the most part, I think I got some useful information out of it. Yes?
I noticed in the people that you've recited so far, other than the two sort of almost hoax conlangs
Right.
in the 1800s, you focused on Auxlang people up through 1960. Are you also, did you do any checking on people Tolkien comes immediately to mind, who would have been before the 1960? Is there any info on that?
I haven't done thorough research on all known conlang creators before the 60s, but of the ones I do know something about, I don't see much evidence that they were really fluent in their conlangs to the degree, even to the degree that I am, much less the degree that you are. From what I can tell, Tolkien's languages weren't fully developed enough for him to become really fluent in them. He could, I'm guessing he was probably about the level that, for instance, Sali or Seldi are with their languages, that they're able to write pretty extensive text in them, but it takes a certain amount of consciously thinking about how the grammar should work and maybe looking up words occasionally. But I don't know that for sure. And similarly, I would guess that, for instance, Edward Foster Powell, is that right? The creator of Roe seems to have, I would guess, was probably in that state, but I don't know enough about him to say for sure. I'm just mentioning people that I have a certain amount of anecdotal evidence that suggests they might have been fluent in the language. Then most of the other early conlangs I know about appear to have not been well enough developed for somebody to plausibly be fluent in them. That would go, for instance, for almost all the early Auxlangs except for Volapük and Esperanto, almost all of the philosophical languages, They seem to have mostly been too sketchy, as far as we can tell from the surviving documentation, to be fully speakable. Though there may have been unpublished documentation that the author may have had it more fully developed than we know about. We just, as far as I know, we don't know of anybody besides these few people. But if there are others, I'd like to hear about them. Anything else? Jeffrey Henning, in the early 90s, used the term model languages for what we now usually call constructed languages or conlangs. And there's a sense in which his term might be more appropriate for most of the things we call conlangs, in that most of them are not fully developed enough to be fully speakable, and even the ones that are fully developed don't have any actual speakers. The word language, as it's used both in ordinary speech and in specialized linguistic terminology, suggests a speaker community, even if a very small one. Or a speaker community having existed in the past, even if it's a dead language. So there's a sense in which we use the word language more strictly, that most conlangs are not actual languages. Only a few of them that have a speaker community could be strictly called languages. But if you consider the case of the speaker and listener being the same person, either different levels of consciousness or the same person at different points on their world line, the past self talking to the future self reading what the past self has written, or listening to a recorded messages from his past self, that even a language with one fluent speaker may be more real, more what we ordinarily think of as a language, than one that has no speakers at all. Matthew Turnbull wrote in reply to my survey, "I want to try and breathe some real life into it. In my opinion, a language is dead as long as there are no people fluent in it. And if there are no native speakers, it's only half alive. I have made it a goal to make it usable and speak it in time for my children to speak it as a first language alongside English." There are several other people who mentioned, either in reply to my survey or in postings to some forum or mailing lists over the years, that they want to do this, to either share the language with their spouse or significant other, or share it with their children. But as far as I've heard, nobody has fully succeeded in doing that. A few people report their spouse or children having learned a few words of the language, or being able to understand some of it even if they can't speak it. But I don't know of any case of someone whose spouse or significant other or children have really become fluent in the language and able to hold freewheeling conversations on whatever subject in the language. Except possibly cases where the language has also been taken up by a wider speaker community. Possibly so. I don't know enough about Mark Okran's use of the Klingon. Yeah, I've heard about that case. My best understanding is the father raising his son speaking Klingon gave up on it after a while because there wasn't enough vocabulary for every domestic household matters.
Well, it was an alien language.
There's an inherent difficulty in learning a language that no one else speaks, over and above whatever difficulties there might be in the language itself, in its complexity or its difficulty, or its difference from our native language, or its irregularity or whatever. A widely accepted theory of language acquisition talks about the need for large amounts of comprehensible input for someone to become fluent in language. Stephen D. Krashen writes, "The comprehension hypothesis refers to subconscious acquisition, not conscious learning. It claims that language acquisition does not happen when we learn and practice grammar rules. Language acquisition only happens when we understand the messages." So how, if at all, does that apply to a lone conlanger learning a language that no one else speaks and probably will never have any other speakers? In order to understand messages, they have to first create them. But as most of us know by experience, you don't have to already be fluent in a language to write text in it. You can consciously apply the rules, you can carefully look up the text, the words you need for your text, and write it, and then go back and reread it. But this theory of language acquisition does suggest that we're probably better off not trying to memorize the grammar rules of our conlangs per se, but rather to use them in creating text, and then let them soak in as we reread the text over and over. It also suggests that the themes we choose for this original writing or translating into our conlangs should be stuff we won't mind reading about over and over. That may seem too obvious to need saying, but it suggests that continuous connected text, whether original stories or diary entries or whatever, is probably more beneficial than just writing sample sentences to illustrate points of grammar or the usage of various words. And it also suggests that it's the rereading of those texts and not the practice of writing them that helps us most in acquiring the language. For acquiring the spoken forms of our conlangs, this theory might suggest listening to recorded speech in the conlang over and over, which would then seem to suggest in order to learn to speak the language, we have to first learn to speak it. But this isn't as binding as it appears. You can, for instance, practice reading from a written text several times before making a recording, and then maybe edit out any further disfluencies and hesitations with sound editing software. So you have a recording of a hypothetical version of yourself who's more fluent than you are yet. But I suspect that based on the answers to my survey, most of the few people who are fluent in the spoken form of their conlangs got that way by talking to themselves out loud a lot, at first hesitantly and then gradually more fluently over time. John Schumann's theory of language acquisition says that fluent second language acquisition tends to happen as a byproduct of acculturation, that is, social and psychological adjustment to an adopted culture. He seems to be thinking primarily about immigrants who are adapting to the culture of their adopted country and acquiring its language at the same time. So can we apply that to conlanging? Are conlangers who have a well-developed imaginary world and fictional culture as a setting for their conlang more likely to become fluent in it than those who don't? There's some anecdotal evidence that it might be helpful for some people. Elizabeth Barrett wrote in reply to my survey, "When I make a concerted effort to learn a language, I choose a name to be the part of myself who will be a native speaker in this language." So she's imaginatively projecting herself into this culture, whether a that language she's learning or a conlang that she's developing. Tony Harris wrote, "I think it was more how I immersed myself in the culture and heritage of the Alorsa people that caused me to immerse myself in the language as well. I have come to identify spiritually in some way with the Alorsa worldview or ethos." So this suggests that strong identification with the constructed culture may be helpful for some conlangers, but I can't yet draw any strong conclusions on that point from the survey data. I don't see any strong correlation looking at the more and less fluent groups of conlangers between those who have an associated culture going with their conlang and those who don't. If there is a correlation, it seems to be slightly negative. But I'll need to do more follow-up research on this, ask more detailed questions in the follow-up survey about, for instance, how well developed someone's conlang culture is. Some people mentioned specifically that yes, there's a conlang culture, but it's not very well developed compared to the language. And other people said explicitly, yes, there's a conlang culture, and I deeply immerse myself in it and identify with it. But most people just said, yes, it's associated with the conlang culture, and here's a few details about it. And yes, the speakers are human or totally environment. We'll get to those questions later. I'll probably also need to control for other variables when I look at that, because I suspect that on average, the languages associated with a strong fictional culture are going to be more difficult than those that aren't on average, because just making a language naturalistically plausible and making it easy are more or less contradictory goals. that was part of my reason for starting over with a new conlang in 1998 as a language to write my diary in, rather than taking one of the naturalistic conlangs I've been working on before and fleshing it out more deeply and expanding it further. Those languages had a certain amount of irregularity to simulate natural language evolution, and I wanted something that would be complex and very different from the languages I studied, but also not unnecessarily difficult, not having irregularity as such. So I started over with a new Inchlang rather than expanding one of the art languages I'd been working on before. Yes?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's grammatical structures that make a language difficult, though. For example, Spanish is highly regular in grammar. However, in idiomatic speech, not so much. I would say that could also be a form of naturalism that applies. I mean, if you have a common culture and you can come up with reasons for odd usage of words. For example, what's up, which stems from the Cold War or something similar, then you've just introduced a high degree of difficulty in learning language, because you then have to figure out why someone would say that. You have to figure out, I mean, that in itself can become an issue.
So he was asking about, what was talking about grammatical complexity or regularity not being the sole or primary factor in how difficult language is. I agree that there are a variety of sources that difficulty in learning a language can come from, but other things being equal, a language with highly irregular, that's highly irregular in some aspect of its grammar or phonology or semantics is going to be more difficult than a language that's very regular in that same aspect. And generally, irregularity is more likely to be found in a naturalistic art lang than in an Oxlang or an Inchlang.
However, it's the idioms that come from exposure to the culture that make even English almost impenetrable. Like, what's up, or call a spade, or
on various levels, where the whole isn't predictable from the parts, whether that's an idiomatic compound or an idiomatic phrase, or whole proverbs and set phrases. Those, in any point where the whole isn't predictable from the parts, is going to make a language more difficult than it would be otherwise.
Like even with English.
And more naturalistic at the same time. Yes?
Even with English as an example, we can say that even our irregular verbs have a tendency to have certain patterns that are somewhat predictable when you compare English with its predecessor languages, those languages that were amalgamated and created in England. So, I mean, but for example, I mean, with present tense, you have one change in conjugation for the verb to run. But English is considered often a very difficult language for other reasons. I just...
Right, the difficulty of English comes mainly from other sources rather than irregularity, but the irregularity is a factor as compared with Oxlangs that have little or no irregularity. But let's move on.
Sorry.
I just saw the 30-minute sign, so there's a lot of material to cover, including the survey results as well as this. So some conlangers, as we've seen, have identified spiritually with their conlangs or concultures. We think of it in spiritual terms and not just as art or as a hobby. I think this attitude may be more common among people who become fluent in their conlangs than among those who don't, but I can't yet say that for certain based on the survey results, given the limitations in the sampling methodology. Jim Hopkins wrote in reply to the survey, "I have found that Itlani is the language of my soul. I feel best when I express myself in it." Tony Harris again wrote, "I see the language and culture as a gift I've been given. So I feel it is in some way an act of worshiping God to continue to work with and on it." He mentioned in conversation that his developing of his conlang and conworld feels more like discovery than creation. On the other hand, it's Tolkien, for instance, wrote about subcreation, about world building and conlanging in particular, and art in general, as means of worshiping God by following in the footsteps of our Creator. God created man and the world, man creates languages and imaginary worlds and other works of art. And this imitation of God is a form of worship. On a slightly less exalted level, some conlangers speak about their conlangs as beneficial to mental health. For instance, Elizabeth Barrett wrote, "I like who I become when I speak it. Working on this language is one of the ways to pull myself out of a bad mood." Joshua James Chenavier, or Chenavier, I'm not sure, wrote in a 1988 posting to the Conlang mailing list, "I like Donovan because it's such a great language to think in. Generally, I prefer not to think in words at all, but when I do, I try always to do it in Donovan. It's like it makes verbal thought like writing a scientific treatise while composing a sonata at the same time." This raises a question I don't have time to go into, which I plan to research further in the follow-up survey. To what extent are people in general thinking in a language rather than having language as an epiphenomenon of their thoughts? To me, introspectively, it seems that most of my thoughts are made of language, and only when I'm thinking about certain subjects in certain modes, about math or art, visual art, am I thinking primarily in visual or other nonverbal modes. But some people introspectively report most of my thinking is nonverbal, and it's only when I get in and talk to somebody that my language turns into verbal form. I'd like to do more research on that and see if it correlates with conlang fluency or anything else. With personal or hermetic languages, languages people devise for personal use or private communication, there's a tension between privacy and publicity. As a user of the language, you want to keep it as private and secret as possible so that your communication with yourself or with your close friends or spouse, perhaps, that also know the language, is as secret as possible. But as a conlanger, as an artist or craftsman, you want to share it with your fellow conlangers, at least to some degree, and get their feedback on it. There are various ways different conlangers have resolved this tension. I started out creating Yazumban, keeping it entirely undocumented and private. But after a while, I changed my mind about that for two reasons. One, I was getting back involved in the conlanger community again, and I had nothing else to share with them, with my fellow conlangers. I was no longer working on naturalistic art language at the time. And secondly, I decided there was no serious danger that anyone would actually learn this language, no matter how well documented. Shalat Yarusha originally kept his Tannerai secret from everybody except in a few letters to his brother when he was writing his diary in it. But later, he published some information about it in the paper Conlang zines of the 80s and early 90s, and then a larger amount of information online. He wrote in the reply to the survey, "To paraphrase Yo, by learning Tanneraic and assisting in its exposure to the outside world, I'm proceeding from the dream outward, externalization. By leaving entirely in my head, however, or in a diary never intended for publication or even private showing, I believe that I'm putting myself at risk of neurosis, at best, or paranoia in the worst case. I'm making Tanneraic a gift. I just do not know to who I am giving it." Some conlangers, such as Bill Price, for instance, the creator of Irregular, he's documented the grammar and lexicon of the language online and published a number of texts in the language, mostly translated. But he keeps the private orthography secret. He hasn't published anything about his own handwritten script that he uses for the language. I've done similarly with Yazumban. I have a couple of orthographies that I use in the web presentation, which have no very close relationship to the handwritten script, but in my case that's at least as much laziness as desire for privacy. Until recently I didn't have access to a scanner and wasn't able to put up images of this, and I'm not really interested yet in getting into font creation software. So Paul Burgess, whom Sally talks about in her book, creator of Manavanantha, has published a long allegorical text in his language, the Manasikri Kilama. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He hasn't ever documented much about the phonology and orthography of his language, so I have to guess. But he said almost nothing about its grammar or lexicon, except in a few brief posts to the Conlang mailing list a few years ago with a very high level overview of the grammar. He hasn't said much about it. Sally wrote in her book, "One wonders what it is that Burgess displays for others if he does not translate it, unless we return to notions of mysticism and its connections with muteness, silence, the hermetic. There's obviously something in the appeal of the spiritual and mysterious that can lead to creations of this sort that more resemble devotion than taxonomy." Robert Dessay, another Australian poet, has kept secret almost every aspect of his language except for its existence. In a 1998 interview, he said, "The language I'd like to talk to you about is a lingua hermetica, a sealed-up language, not quite airtight, private, but hardly secret. A little batty, a touch alchemical. The point of K, and at its verb of tenere as well, I imagine, is something else entirely opposed to communication, opposed to the exteriorization that Gela Pierucci was talking about. Something much dottier, something closer to an older meaning of hermetic, tinged as it was with suggestions of alchemy, something to which communicability is actually an affront. This may not be true of all dreamt-up languages, but it's certainly true of K. So given this diversity in the way Conlangers relate to their languages, I wonder if there might be people who, even if they're aware of the Conlang community, choose not to say anything about their private language to anyone. Similarly, there can be a tension between Conlang as a work of art, which we want to make as perfect as possible, and the Conlang as a tool for private communication, for which stability is much more important than perfection. Anne Rosta, in a posting to the Conlang mailing list last July, made the analogy of a motorcyclist who's always rebuilding his bike and never gets to ride it. Some Conlangers, although they intend to become fluent in their languages, say they're willing to make any changes they feel necessary to make it just right, even if that involves a setback in learning it. Some say, in order to become fluent in it, in order to advance their learning of it, they'll hold back on making changes that they would kind of like to make, just because they don't want to have to relearn things they've already learned. But a few people said this hasn't been an issue for them, that so far they haven't found any need to change anything that they've already learned. Are there any questions at this point before I go on to the survey results? Whoever's the corner. So the general demographic data, this is the overall results for everybody applying to the survey. The average age of the respondents, a bit over 37 years, about 15 and a half when they first started creating languages, and about 26 when they first attained a certain amount of fluency in one of their languages. We can't simply subtract to assume, oh, okay, the average person who is fluent in the language has been so for 11 years, because a fair number of people said, I used to be fluent in one of my languages, but I'm not anymore. Hit page down a bit, scroll down, okay. As with previous surveys, the vast majority of the respondents are male. Scroll down a little more. The people giving silly responses or no responses all had masculine first names for whatever it's worth. Scroll down a bit. Mostly Usonian nationality, a few English and German and Canadian and Dutch, then smaller numbers from various other places. I left these pretty much as they were, including some idiosyncratic let's page down a couple more times to the next question. Again, country of residence, again, mostly the US, then Germany, the UK, Canada, and one or two each from several other countries. These add up to more than 100% people having ancestors from more than one place. mostly English and German ancestry, then Irish, Scotch, Dutch, etc. Go on to the next question. Mostly English as the native language, since the survey was posted in English. Then other Germanic languages, and then one each from French and Chiat is Quebec dialect of French. So I could have added that in, but I left it. There were 4 bilingual, natively bilingual respondents. Scrolling down, and then another table where we add the all the number of speakers, native speakers of each language, including the bilinguals, so that increases the number of English and Spanish and German speakers going down. Most of the respondents haven't really organized that in an order as such of most of least education, but most of the respondents have at least some college, and a fair number have higher ed degrees. Not surprisingly, the single largest number of people had majored in linguistics or were going to major in linguistics. Then adding together, I haven't added this yet, adding together various other individual language specializations would probably add the second largest. And then computer science and various other, go on to the next question. So, let's keep going. Here I added together all the people who indicated that they have some supernatural beliefs but aren't members of an organized religion. And here I added together the people who answered none, or atheist or agnostic. Scroll down. Then I added together all the people whose answers were unambiguous enough for me to classify, and got these proportions here. There's less variety in people's answers to this question. Here, again, these answers had to more than 100% people giving multiple answers to this question. The largest single goal people mentioned was naturalism, creating a naturalistic and plausible language. Let's keep going. There's passionate people can read a little bit of it. This is going to be on the Language Creation Society website, so you can look at it later.
It already is.
Already is? Okay. Again, the majority had conlangs associated with the culture, but I don't know, I didn't ask detailed questions to say how fully developed is that culture. Most of those have human speakers, a few have non-speakers, human speakers, but I think most of them are fairly humanoid aliens. I don't think any of the respondents to this survey, or very few anyway, had extremely non-human languages that violate human language universals like Halen, for instance. Keep going. The majority of respondents had a priori languages, just made it not based on a natural language. Let's go through the rest of this, the rest of the typological variables quickly. I will look at those more closely when we get to the comparison. Okay. I'm not sure how useful this is. People gave such a wide variety of answers to this question about how complete you consider your language to be that I wasn't able to really analyze that numerically very well. I came up with estimated percentages based on people's verbal answers and averaged them. But I'm not sure how much that really means. It's too interpretative to really mean much. But here, a few people volunteered information about how many words there were in their lexicon. Average of 3,100 words in the lexicon. We'll look at that later with comparison of more or less fluent groups. A slight majority said their language was probably complete enough to be speakable, although a lot of them can't yet speak it. Most people said that their language did have some features that would make it difficult for speakers of their native language, but almost everyone said it would was basically a human language that we did not violate human language universals. Go on. Okay, slight majority of the respondents, and again I caution about the flaws in the sample and methodology, said that yes, they're interested in becoming fluent in their conlang. Scroll down. Not quite that far. Of the people who are becoming fluent in their conlang or have become fluent, a fair number said that yes, they acquired some fluency unexpectedly as a result of developing and using language. That they didn't set out to do that, but they got that anyway, just in the ordinary use of the language. Further down, this is slightly different. This is the goals and purposes for learning and using the language, as opposed to the earlier question about what are the goals and purposes for the conlang per se, as a hobby or work of art or whatever. People mentioned thinking in the language, private communication. There was people intending to use it with a significant other or family members, children, for instance. Keep going. Proving language workable. A couple people said that specifically. I remember John Kihara said specifically, if I ever decide to become fluent in it, for instance, after I retire, the main reason would be to prove wrong to people who said it couldn't possibly be smoking. A couple people mentioned enlivening the language, bringing it to life as the final stage in creation of the language. For instance, Matthew Turnbull, who I quoted earlier. Keep going. A couple people mentioned writing their diary, although a large number of people actually mentioned that they have used or plan to use the language for that. So keep going.
Externalization, like that.
That's from Java Garugia's response, where he said, I'm bringing the language from the dream outward. Let's keep going. A fairly large subset say they can write in the language without having to look up words and grammatical structures. Again, a few people say they used to have more fluency in the language than they do now. Language that they were working on a while ago, but they've moved on to other conlangs and lost the fluency that they had in the earlier ones that keep going. Nearly half say they can write in the language at normal speed. Keep going. And fully half say they can reread earlier text without having to look things up. Keep going. Minorities say they sometimes find themselves thinking spontaneously in language. That brings in the question of to what extent people normally think in any language, whether they're native language or whatever language they're fluent in. But keep going. Go on. I want to get to the comparison before we run out of time. Keep going. Okay, here. Most people say they haven't dreamed in their conlangs. A few people say, yes, I have dreamed in the conlang. One person says they never dream verbally. That ties into that question of whether people normally think verbally or not. Go on. 10 people said that they've dreamed about conlanging in general, or about other imaginary conlangs that they haven't actually developed. And 2 people said that they have a conlang that resulted from a dream. Keep going. More than half say they can read aloud at conversational speed in their conlang. Only 17% say they can speak spontaneously at conversational speed. Keep going. I think that question was a little too ambiguous to mean that the responses to mean anything. Keep going. Most people who have made recordings say they can understand them when they're played back later. Keep going. And then here are the subjects people say they can use their conlang for if only certain subjects. Scroll down slowly. Basics. People mentioned the basic things you would cover in the first couple of lessons of a language. Hello, my name is, hello, goodbye, things like that.
Didn't have that for years.
Keep going. The vast majority haven't found anybody else to seriously learn the language. A few people mentioned they've had some people get a little bit interested in it and use it for a little while, but just only one person, Sonia Kisa, previous Tokikana, has had several people really learning the language thoroughly. Keep going. The inverse relay was where we would, we'll talk about that more tomorrow maybe, where people would learn something of the conlang of the next person in the relay and write text in that person's language, and then pass it on for that person to read text in their language not written by themselves. Keep going. Let's go ahead and skip to the end and go to the next file.
Next file.
Yes. Okay, and increase the font size several times. Scroll down a bit. The more fluent, back up. A large proportion of the more fluent are married than of the less fluent set. That's kind of counterintuitive. I would have guessed that married people are less likely to have leisure time for conlanging. Keep going. Here again, it's interesting. A larger proportion of the fluent set are of some particular religion rather than of none. The less fluent set, almost all the atheists and agnostics are not fluent in their conlang. Keep going to the next. And again, we see similar results down here. A fair number of those who are fluent in their conlang or trying to become so said they intend to use it or do use it for prayer. Keep going. Again, not surprising, most of a large proportion of the fluent set have a language with similar topology to the married language. Keep going to the other topology variables, slow down a little bit for each one. This is a little bit counterintuitive. I would expect fusional languages to be a little more difficult than agglutinative on all other things equal. Scroll down. Again, this is not surprising since all of the native languages of the respondents are accusative alignment. And I found the active alignment of Gazimbun a more difficult aspect of it to learn than its object, verb, subject, word order, for instance. Scroll down some more. It's not surprising that the fluent set have vocabulary on average 3 times larger than those of the non-fluent set. Scroll down. Again, almost half of those who are fluent in their conlang didn't intend to become so when they started. And I think we're here at the end of the comparison. There's a lot more analysis to do on the survey data that I haven't had time for. When I eventually publish the article about this, it'll have a lot more analysis of the survey data and hopefully more statistically reliable analysis. I need to get some help from someone who knows more statistics than I do to be confident about how statistically significant these differences between the sets are. Are there any further questions now?
Actually, I want to make 2 points, one about the survey and one about model languages. Great job on the survey. I'm a professional market researcher and very rarely do I hear correctly express all the caveats. It's a very thorough job. So I'm very impressed. The second point is just model languages. I call it that because I didn't know constructed languages as a term or plan languages yet.
Any other questions now?
Behind you.
Yes.
I probably ought to say this for the end of your talk, but I think I'll do it.
Go ahead.
Is this the end?
This is the end. Final questions.
This isn't a question so much as a comment. Going back to either you or it might have been Sally. No, I think it was you mentioned that someone when you learn another language, they take on a name.
It was Elizabeth Barrett, survey.
Yeah, that there's sort of a fiction about my own work, the way I think of that. Sort of the fantasy is of myself being in a time travel situation, because the world that I work with is a fictional place to see North America. Myself being transported back to that, and being an outsider, having to learn, adapt to these cultures, learn these languages, but never able to be a part of it to the degree that the speakers are never quite understanding their ways and their languages as well as they do, never able to, the constant outsider.
So whereas some Conlangers have kind of fantasy of themselves as a native speaker of this language, as a native member of this Con culture, you're imagining yourself as an anthropologist visiting the Con culture.
No, not an anthropologist at all. Someone literally
a stranger who is trapped there and has to learn the language. Sink or swim.
Presumably that's where I would have to spend the rest of my life, but never quite able to adapt to it. It's always just a little bit beyond understanding. I can learn to speak the languages, but not quite as well as they do. Never quite understand their ways, their history, their mythology, the way that they do. It's the outsider looking in. That's my private fantasy.
That sounds about real life to me.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just, you mentioned already that fluency being something we're probably considering that it is you working with yourself to teach yourself a language.
Right.
But you mentioned when the language changes, it being an upset to your gaining fluency or something else. I don't know if it necessarily applies, but a natural language changes constantly. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing, and nothing is static. Much to the chagrin of some English teachers.
Right, but it's usually not changing so fast as to make a big difference to the experience of, for instance, an immigrant who's learning the language spoken around them, or a student learning a foreign language in school or whatever. The language is not changing on that time scale. Whereas a Conlanger creating a language and still not quite sure what the language should be or what the language is, if they're thinking in terms of discovery rather than creation, they can change on a much faster time scale than natural languages do, and become. So it's like, for instance, you sign up for an old French course at university, and halfway through the semester, the professor says, "Okay, we're going to be studying Middle French," and then a couple of weeks before the final, they say, "Okay, we're going to be studying Modern French instead."
You keep speaking, just remember the great vowel shift.
Well, I think
Go
it's
ahead.
that no real changes happen to the basic structure of the language. We don't change the vowel, we don't change we don't change prepositions or a manner of things. But we learn with great rapidity all sorts of computer expressions and slang expressions and idioms that come in primarily because it doesn't change the radical components.
Right. Amanda?
Yes. I also had a comment from when you mentioned changes making it harder to learn. And I noticed that you didn't have a category for, I never have a problem learning my changes because they make more sense than the old way.
I should ask about that in the follow-up. Any other questions?
Thank you all very much.